more capable electronics, with computers, with better sensors, and so on. What has not changed is the effectiveness of nuclear weapons in destroying cities. The offensive force has the job of having some of his nuclear weapons survive to be launched, survive in boost, that is, in powered flight for ballistic missiles, in coast or fall through space, in re-entry. And there is a lot of effort to make these things survive, far exceeding the effort and cost put into building the nuclear weapons themselves or the delivery systems. There are some general purpose aids to countering defenses. For instance, decoys in space, very benign, no atmospheric drag, and so very easy to put up inflatable decoys which mimic the radar and infrared signatures of re-entry vehicles, to the extent that we have finally given up a space defense against missiles after they have launched their MIRVs and possible decoys. There is a wide maneuvering re-entry vehicle for city attack. We don't waste our payload building these things because there is no city defense. But we would, and it was in our 1968 paper. There is the idea of layered defense. Give me a 20% penetration capability or an 80% kill probability in a system, and if I have 3 or 4 independent systems, 0.2 times 0.2 times 0.2 is a small enough number that one might say one has a defense. But we do not have these effective, 80% effective defenses or independent systems. Now, in particular, people have been talking about countering ballistic missiles in boost phase, and that's because there are only 1,000 launchers instead of 10,000 MIRVs and 100,000 decoys. The launchers are visible, they're much softer, and one might even have a second chance. So I have a few foils to discuss this. Could I have the first one, please? Well, one talks about space weapons against ballistic missiles. You have 2 technical possibilities: satellite-based, permanently there. You deploy this system, you make sure it works, you exercise it, and that's one possibility. The other possibility is, because, as I will point out, satellite-based systems are exquisitely vulnerable, you will have a pop-up system, which after warning of the launch of Soviet ballistic missiles will pop up and destroy them. In both cases, the idea is to intercept in boost phase, because I have explained that in the free fall or re-entry, we've tried that and don't do it very well. The general purpose counter to satellite-based systems is space mines. Taking every advantage of microelectronic technology, little things will follow the big satellites along and be preemptively detonatable by radio control. And I point out that there is a precedent for this. Soviets have ships in all of our carrier task forces. If those ships carried nuclear weapons, they could destroy those task forces at the moment of outbreak of war. And we tolerate it because we want to make free use of the sea. It is more important to us to be able to live on the sea than to have a war there to sweep in peacetime Soviet ships from the sea. Senator Wallop, a year ago, solicited his colleagues. He said, 24 satellites, 10 megawatt lasers, 10 meter diameter dish, somewhat higher than this room, perfect mirrors, and so on, could beat the Soviet threat. It's not true. Each of the satellites in medium Earth orbit would have to sanitize an area 2,500 kilometers in radius. And of course, I don't know whether Senator Wallop understands that, but satellites cannot be clustered in medium Earth orbit against Soviet launchers. They are distributed all over the world. So only 1 or 2 satellites would have to handle the 1,000 boosters in 200 seconds or so. That would mean that you could have half micron radiation for the technical people here if you had a perfect mirror, and if you had a satellite which every 0.2 of a second could point from one booster to another and melt it. And at a very modest hardening of the booster. Not feasible. From geosynchronous orbit, 24,000 miles away, you can say, if Senator Wallop is really right, these would have to have hard ultraviolet radiation, which we don't really know how to make, perfect mirrors at that wavelength, and they are beatable by space mines. Nonsense. Next slide, please. How about the pop-up system? Well, you would not want to pop up multi-ton lasers in a few hundred seconds to destroy the Soviet boosters. I could explain why I don't have time. Maybe one could use a nuclear explosive-driven X-ray laser, as was described to the National Press Club last fall. It was said that there had been a test of such things, that it was possible to collimate X-ray energy, and that this was a portentous development. Nothing has appeared in the US literature, but one has a July 1981 Soviet Journal of Quantum Electronics article by Bunkin, Derzhev, and Yakovlenko. And there they talk about a 20 kiloton nuclear explosion in space and collimating to a milliradian using brass wires to begin with, which expand to a millimeter or 2 millimeters diameter, and X-ray wavelengths of 14 angstroms for you old folks, 1.4 nanometers for the newer folks, a kilovolt for everybody. Directing the energy into 1 part in 10 million of the sphere and a brightness increase of factor 10 to the 4 over the nuclear weapon X-ray yield in space. But is that bright enough? Look at 6,000 miles. The energy density on the booster is 1/100th of a calorie per square centimeter. And in our article in 1968, we talked about hardness of boosters against pulsed X-rays of a calorie per square centimeter, maybe 10 calories per square centimeter. So there's a lot of growth required there before one has a weapon, not fat. But maybe the Soviets aren't so smart as we are. Next slide, please. Here's a picture of a problem. Here is an MX missile in early boost phase, and you see kilometers along the x-axis, kilometers along the y-axis, and time, 100 and some seconds to 120 kilometers. Now, you can't attack these things too early. The X-rays don't go through the atmosphere. You can't attack them too late because you don't see them anymore after boost phase, and the MIRVs have been launched. Next slide, please. So here is a problem. The pop-up geometry, the purple circle is the Earth with a 4,000-mile radius. At the top, the missile has been launched in the blue arc. It is coming down a range R later, 6,000 nautical miles, for instance, more than that statute miles, where we are over on the left. And we have our pop-up defense there. It has to pop up to see around the curve of the Earth. This is hello, Columbus. The Earth is round, and the Earth is a very good shield. So if you have to pop up, you must get to line of sight, and you must get there before you have burnout. So the first thing you want to do in a system study, even if you assume X-ray lasers are feasible and so on, is to do this calculation. And at 6,000-mile range, statute miles actually, for a booster which is at 200-mile altitude, you have to pop up 3,000 miles to be at line of sight. Well, it takes some time to go through the atmosphere at modest speed so you don't burn up like a meteor on the way out. I assumed instant burn, 200 seconds to booster burnout, and those are mass ratios. Enormously big things to get your booster up, your X-ray laser up there. Next slide, please. Calculate mass ratio. What will the other side do during the years we are demonstrating this system, perfecting this system, and so on? They will go to longer range. They will plan to disrupt the defense. They will harden their boosters, or at least not soften their boosters if, in fact, one can produce only calories per square centimeter. They will suppress the defense. They will attack the defense. They will feint. They will have missiles, boosters, which will be launched just for fun. They will have faster burn to be burned out before we can respond. And they could emphasize cruise missiles. There are lots of ways around. Actually, they should ignore this system. Now, maybe it's a good thing. Maybe it won't work if the Soviet Union tries to beat it, but if we have an arms control environment where the Soviet Union cooperates in eliminating nuclear weapons, perhaps the defense will work. There are much simpler arms control regimes of that type. For instance, about 3 minutes more, Dave. If defense emphasis arrives only by agreement or by a unilateral U.S. capability and an imposition on the Soviet Union, there are alternatives. This is an admittedly difficult transition. That is, we have the ability now and the commitment to destroy the other society if either society destroys directly. And we want to move, or the president wants to move to a situation in which no matter what one society does, it cannot hurt the other society. And he recognized in his speech that the combination of a good defense and an offensive capability gives an aggressive capability, and nobody wants that. But it's a difficult transition to persuade the other side that this is all in their interest and that if they behave well, we will share this system with them. Why would not the Soviet Union allow us to have absolute safety and offensive power and impose a government over them? After all, our government's more efficient. People seem to be at least as happy. We do not worry about a nuclear threat from Georgia or from California, and it will be a better world if the United States runs the Soviet Union and makes them the 53rd through the 100th state. It seems safer and cheaper. Now, on a more practical point, the Scowcroft panel report has a lesson for us. The purpose of the MX missile initially was to have an invulnerable basing for our ICBMs. That purpose has been given up. It is technically infeasible, but the MX remains absolutely essential according to the Scowcroft Commission. Why? To show that once we make up our mind to do something, we never change it. Could I have the final slide, please? On January 27th, I testified to the Scowcroft Commission, and I said, here's what you ought to do about strategic forces. Improve the command and control and intelligence. Build the Minuteman missile. Improve the accuracy in Minuteman so that it can kill Soviet silos. Totally feasible. The Air Force had a program ever since 1979. $4 billion cost. 1,650 warheads would become silo killers in 4 years. Cheaper and better than the MX in the Minuteman silo. If we are wanting to threaten the Soviet Union to bring them to the bargaining table, that's what we should have done. That's what we should do now. So I recommended that. Then develop and deploy this buried bomb, a nuclear silo BMD. Have advanced nuclear weapons, plowshare weapons, clean bombs buried in front of the silos, which will at least pose uncertainty, the greatest merit of DensePack, according to its supporters in the late phases. Develop the small ICBM with a single warhead, and deploy it first, no matter what the Soviets do, in 450 Minuteman II silos. Develop an ASAT vehicle, because the Soviets have one, and I really do not want to have weapons in space, so I want to have an anti-satellite vehicle. That is sufficiently difficult to understand that it comes in later in the slide. Ratify SALT II. After all, we're abiding by SALT II. The Soviets say they will abide by SALT II as long as we do, and we will then have a base to negotiate a further protocol modification later to allow demerving, that is, to allow us to build more silos for this little small ICBM, 10 tons instead of a 100-ton missile, giving up the entitlement to 2 MIRVed warheads for each one of these small ICBM warheads we deploy. And, by the way, negotiate a protocol to allow buried bomb and non-nuclear close-in defense of many more than 100 silos, if the Soviets are willing. That will help them to defend their strategic offensive force and allow us to. And finally, and probably most urgently, aside from getting rid of the MX program, ban anti-satellite tests and all weapons in space. We will have a capability to attack Soviet satellites untested. They will have a capability to attack ours. Neither one of us would benefit by a war in space, which would be the result of a defense emphasis on space weapons, which would require us to proclaim the inadmissibility of Soviet space mines near our satellites, and they to fight off our space mines in peacetime near their satellites. So I think this is what I would like to do, and I will be ready to answer for my statements in the discussion. Thank you.
Have discussion until after all of the speakers have given their presentations, and we'll now proceed to hear from Edward Teller.
I have tremendous difficulties with technology because I'm trying to time myself. Dick took 22 minutes, but I can't get beyond that. Now, not only did I have this success, but I had a very great pleasure, as I always have, when I come back to Los Alamos. Particularly when it is snowing in April. Now, of course, I don't want to disappoint you, and I want to argue with Dick only about points which are not completely self-evident. But there are a few. On the 23rd of March, Hans Bethe and I were invited to listen to the talk of the president. To my hearing, what he said had an ever so slightly different emphasis. First, he said, the Soviets are stronger in nuclear weapons than we are. Dick doesn't believe it. I do. And I want to point out one very simple fact. The bearer of bad news is never popular. And presidents like to be popular. Ronald Reagan is not the first president who had reason to say the Soviets are stronger. He is the first president who had the courage to say it and who realized that the American people have an absolute right to know about their danger. He also said, mutual assured destruction has worked so far. Happily enough, he said, we cannot rely on it into the indefinite future. And he challenged the scientific community to come up with something better, with real defense. I believe this was a statement no less in importance than the action of President Roosevelt when he started to follow Einstein's advice at that time, and in the face of the Nazi threat, develop an atomic bomb. He did not take counsel. He went right ahead with excellent intuition. He did not do it openly. He did it, and probably had to do it at that time, in secret. President Reagan acted after plenty of deliberation, spoke after plenty of deliberation. And he spoke openly so that all American people should know. Now I would like to change my approach slightly. In 1969, there was an ABM debate in which I vigorously participated. At that time, my estimate was, and I don't trust any of these estimates, not mine, not Dick's, not anybody else's, that the defense will be 3 times as expensive as the offsetting attack. And I don't think defense is really feasible unless it can be made cheaper than the attack. Only then will it predominate. Only then will it have a real influence. Yet I advocated ABM. Why? Because I had to talk on the basis of what we knew at that time. And it has been invariably true that when scientists put their minds to a difficult job, they could perform very much better, even better than 2 great scientists have predicted in 1968. Or 78? 1968. They knew the future. In 69, I sort of agreed with them. Too difficult. But I still defended it because I hoped we could do better. And I want to tell you about a little incident. The media of Montana, very strange action, invited me to talk at their convention. And I agreed not only because I like to talk, I also agreed because it was to be in Glacier National Park in the lodge 1 day before the season opened. Beautiful weather. I went out for a walk in the morning. A number of people came with me. In the afternoon, it rained cats and dogs. And the man who introduced me, he said, "You may still remember the beautiful sunshine this morning." And Dr. Teller went out for a walk, and some of us went with him. And 200 yards here from the lodge, he picked up a big stick. And I asked Dr. Teller, "What's that big stick for?" Now I have to interrupt my own story and tell you that I lied. Hans knows this very well. I have a bum leg. I can't walk on rough terrain without a big stick. But this somehow I did not want to explain. And very dishonestly I said, "This big stick is against the grizzly bears." And the man who introduced me said, "But Dr. Teller, don't you know that this big stick is not good enough against the grizzly bears?" And Dr. Teller answered me, "Yes, I know, but I hope the grizzly bears don't." Dr. Teller will talk about ABM. That was the introduction. If a defense is not good enough, but the grizzly bears don't know that it is not good enough, it will work. Because the Soviets, in their desire for power, I believe, do not take second place after Hitler. The Soviet leaders, the all-powerful Soviet leaders who have been powerful for 700 years, changed their minds, changed their names from Tsars to Soviets. Their action changed less. But other than Hitler, they and also all their predecessors have been exceedingly cautious. They will not start a conflict unless they are sure they can win. I believe that the scientists in this country have now the clear obligation to find the proper defense against the grizzly bears. The only question is, can it be done? This is an extremely important discussion, and the discussion cannot proceed. I was told that while this meeting is for badge holders only, it is still unclassified. And I am arguing we are overclassified, and therefore I try strictly to adhere to the classification as I know it. But any stupid idea about a defense can be published. The right ideas cannot be. The stupid ideas are then discussed in detail. That is not misinformation. That is disinformation. And the KGB could not do better. We are doing it to ourselves. And one appeal to this group of wonderful people is to help in thinking how the American people can be better informed. The president said that which the Kremlin knows, the American people should know. The bureaucrats are hard of hearing. A few months ago, I have been forbidden even to mention X-ray lasers. Now I can mention them, but I cannot tell you anything more about them. Yet it follows from what Garvin said. The Soviet leaders know in detail about the X-ray lasers. We should be able to discuss them. And I claim that in the years since 1968, in 15 years, a great number of very excellent defensive ideas have come forward, and we are not allowed to discuss any of them. Now, I'm not asking all of you to believe all of these ideas. I believed none of them when I heard them first. After all, I'm a little advanced in age, I'm not supposed to have new ideas, but I have some young friends. And these young friends have remarkable ideas. And they come to my office and they tell me about them and I throw them out. It's nonsense. But they learn something from me. They learn to be persistent. And they come back and explain to me a second time and give me some more proof. And I'm not even allowed to tell you what this proof is. Not only about X-ray lasers, but about this, that, and the third thing. Many of them invented here. And other than in 1968 or 69, I now not only believe that defense is possible, I believe it can be made less expensive than the offsetting attack. Remember that attack predominates is not an eternal truth. After the First World War, it was generally known that 4 times as many forces were needed to break through the enemy defenses. Defense had it. The German military did not like it. They introduced new ideas. And all through the Second World War, the offense had the advantage. The capstone was the atomic bomb, which made it obvious that no defense is possible. Now I claim defense is possible. And while I cannot argue in detail, I can argue in generalities. In the past, offense had the disadvantage because the people who were attacking had to move farther, and by the time they got into battle, their legs were tired. And even their elephants got worn out in the passes of the Alps. Today, the attacking missiles, to take just one instance, because the question of defense is not only defense against missiles, it's defense against everything. He has to shoot over a longer distance. He has to carry a higher weight. The defense can work with much less expensive sprint missiles. They can be made very much more numerous. I believe in general, in a specific case, once it is understood, defense will be cheaper than that much offense which will offset it. Nevertheless, the offense has one terrific advantage, of which it never can be deprived. The offense has the initiative. The defender has to think of everything. The defender has to be flexible. It seems to me to follow that brute force, making more of the same, does favor the offense. Real, comprehensive ingenuity did favor the defense in the past and might do so again. I am not saying that it can be done, because what I want to do is to make defense cheaper than the offsetting offense. It's a high purpose, a difficult purpose. One eminent scientist wrote recently, to talk about defense is wishful thinking at best. We invited him to Livermore, and after 2 days, perhaps wrongly, he said, this defense is excellent. None of us, not the very best, and I'm talking about the very best, none of us is clever enough to see the whole future. The president has challenged us, and we must try. There was question of the MX missile. No question in my mind. The MX missile should be deployed. The recommendation to deploy them in Minuteman silos is reasonable. In one phase of the discussion at least, my friend Dick Garvin proposed that they should be defended. And I think they should be, for two purposes. Without defense, the MX will be useless unless we shoot on warning. And to shoot on warning is almost as bad as a first strike and as destabilizing. Mutual assured destruction, balance of terror, is destabilizing. Because the terror is certain, the balance is not. We know that the Soviets have a defensive system around Moscow. And according to Dick, they are out of their minds. I don't think so. They have just now replaced their defensive system with a vastly improved defensive system. And they continue their research. There we sit back and assume that people will never be as clever as two eminent authors, more clever than two eminent authors could be in 1968. Now I want to turn around. And I want to name to you explicitly the point where I am most worried about the defense. Not worried enough to give up. But one problem which I think should be taken very seriously is the early and prompt detection and reporting of an attack. That depends on our eyes in space. And our eyes in space are exceedingly vulnerable. We should do all kinds of things. We should do for put up for every observing satellite 3 others, which are quiet, which are packed into a smallest possible volume, look innocuous. Then, when our observing satellite is shut down, you can deploy it. And together with each of these silent observers, you can easily put up 100 decoys. Because, as correctly said, decoys in space may be relatively easy. And then it will be difficult for the Soviets at one stroke to put away all of this. I think it should be brought into the consciousness of people that to put out your enemy's eyes is one of the most dangerous acts of war and must be so considered. And the average American does not understand it. Shall we hope for negotiations? In a difficult situation, one may try anything. But our main hope has been placed for a quarter of a century in negotiations of various kinds. We had a test moratorium, and we were told by the CIA that any preparation for test will be discovered 3 months in advance. No question about it. It was prepared in Novaya Zemlya, a God-forsaken place, where preparation should be most easily noticed. We knew about that test series 2 days before it started, when Khrushchev announced it. I would like to know that in a time where research on defensive weapons is the main question, or is at least one of the main questions, can we devise a system where the Soviets will really not go ahead in their laboratories and in their minds to impose on the world what they consider the highest of blessing, a government by the Kremlin? I'm afraid that a government by the Kremlin is a realistic possibility for the future, a world government. We don't want government. We don't want world government. We want mutual understanding. We want collaboration. We are not as safe as 25 years ago, when we started to negotiate about disarmament. I don't think treaties can effectively forbid anything. Treaties can stimulate real collaboration. We should work with our allies on defensive weapons. We should work with the Third World to eliminate the causes of war. There are many active ways toward peace. And one of them is diminishing secrecy, so that at least we should understand the issues. Ladies and gentlemen, a long time ago, in 1943 and 2 years thereafter, the fate of the world was determined to a great extent in Los Alamos. I claim, and I doubt that I can be seriously contradicted, that had we failed to develop the atomic bomb, I'm quite sure the Soviets would have developed it later. We would never have been able to counter it. And today, there would be Soviet government throughout the world. Today, this situation has occurred. We had tried negotiations. We have tried to make the Soviets feel safe through parity. It did not work. The experimental people among us should pay a little attention, even in human affairs. What experiments have shown. Defensive weapons have not been seriously tried. For years, we have been mesmerized by the impossibility of defense. In the 60s, I started to have doubts. Perhaps defense is possible. In the 70s, I started to have convictions. Today, I see a purpose. If defensive weapons are cheaper to deploy than the corresponding offense, then by the year 2000, we may spend 5% of our strategic expenditure on retaliation and 95% on defense, active defense and civil defense. Because all Americans, including our government, want peace more than they want power. For those who have invaded Afghanistan, broke a treaty and used poison gas in that invasion, there I am less clear about the purpose. If we manage to develop good defensive weapons by the collaboration of the very best scientists, then these scientists will have contributed to peace immeasurably. We had excellent ideas. These ideas are not good enough. The ideas that will come now will be better. We shouldn't do it alone. We should do it together with all our allies, except the French, of course. I would exclude the French, let them protest, and then gracefully give in. We have all one purpose, and only one purpose: to preserve peace and stability, to bring safety into the world, and a world in which defensive weapons predominate will feel safe. It won't be safe, but it will feel much safer than we can feel today. And this feeling of safety will make it possible not to change the mind of Antropov, the butcher of Budapest, the would-be murderer of the Pope. We may change the minds, slowly, of the children of the present Soviet leadership. So far, democracy has not produced strength. So far, the democracies have not produced real stability. If by unity we can produce strength and stability, then the possibility for eliminating the causes of war will exist. And this will be peace. Thank you.